Hey all. I wanted to go over two quick things before we really get started here, if that is alright with you. First of all, I have had several questions asking me about my video game reviews in general and why, what's going on with the Half-Life 2 review. A rather valid point was brought up, which is why I'm addressing it, that, I'm capable of doing these other reviews, why not do Half-Life 2? Now, the problem there, I'm not saying this to engender sympathy. Okay, I want to stress that. This is just fact and reality. I am not physically capable at the moment of handling the stress of sitting down and playing Half-Life 2. That may sound like a joke, but I know there are at least some of you out there who know what I mean. It does take energy and effort to sit up and do this for an extended period of time, especially for several hours at a sitting. And on top of that, I would rather be as on top of my game as I can for a game like Half-Life 2, because it's Half-Life 2, for goodness sakes. Another point that has been brought up in a similar vein is the fact that I could do a Half-Life 2 review right now, because I know the game well enough to do so. And indeed, I already know several of the thoughts that I'm going to be sharing when I get to that review. This is true. But it is my desire, my hope, I should say, to play the game through first and get a fresh perspective on it, and frankly to enjoy it again. I mean, it's a fantastic game. I'd love to play it again. But I'm not saying that as an excuse. It's just anybody who watches my videos knows that I do try to hold myself up to a certain level of quality. There's no artificial bar or anything like that. It's just I would like to do the best job that I can. And I feel that in this case I would rather play the game again freshly and uniquely, because it has been several years before I delve into it. Now, and this is true for most, if not all, of the games I review. There have been a few individual exceptions where I have not gone back and replayed them recently, within at least less than a year's time before I reviewed them. Very few exceptions. But I do try to do that in general. Um, One other question that has come up, and this has come up before I even got to this review, a surprisingly large number of times, so I feel I'm going to address it here. Do I think Half-Life 1 or Half-Life 2 is the superior game? Which one is better? Now, that is actually a very good question, but I'm not going to answer that yet. You'll have to wait for the review. Sorry. My sense of humor is kind of screwed up, too. um, Second thing. I do hope this daily thing is working out for you guys. I welcome feedback, preferably, constructive feedback, whether it's positive or negative, I don't care, as long as it's constructive, about this whole daily thing. This hasn't been particularly stressful for me, because if it's not obvious by now, and indeed this should be obvious since I'll be uploading this several days after I record this, that I've been recording in advance. Basically, whenever I have the time and opportunity to. The only niggle is sometimes I upload during the evening and sometimes I upload during the morning, and that has to do with the fact that our internet is not the greatest thing in the world, and so whenever I upload, it destroys our bandwidth for the 40 or so minutes that it takes to upload a video. Yeah, there's complications, trust me. But anyways, point being, it destroys bandwidth, and I don't want to ruin anybody else's problems who happen to be on our network while I'm doing so. So I tend to upload whenever people aren't on. But other than that, I've been trying to keep this daily thing going, and I think it's working pretty well. I'm rather pleased with the fact that I have maintained one video a day so far. I know some of you out there obviously probably don't care for it because, it's not a video game review every day, which I'm not sure is even feasible. Even if that was like a full-time job, I'm not 100% sure I could do that. I mean, I'd try, but wow. Um, but bottom line, any feedback you guys have on that is welcome, as long as it's real feedback. The third point is that I wanted to point out that several people have asked me why Voyager. Why is this the show you latched onto of the ones that were suggested? Obviously, Voyager and several other shows were requested. In fact, actually, I think I have that list here on the laptop somewhere. Not here, obviously. This is the video game requests, which I'll be doing soon enough. But anyways, why Voyager instead of so many other shows that are, frankly, vastly superior? The real reason for that is because I don't view Voyager as a bad show per se. I really don't. That should be obvious given by the fact that I keep talking relatively positively about it. But I do view Voyager as a failed show because it had so much potential, and one of the things that I like about Voyager is it is mentally stimulating and engaging. Now that sounds kind of odd, but Voyager gets me thinking. There are subtleties in this show. I'll talk about one today in this episode. There are nuances. But more importantly than that, every time they fail, it makes me think about what could have been, about what should have been, about what might have been. Voyager is a show I have rewritten at least in 3 different formats over the years. Just up here in my head, the overall show arc. I've done once was a collaborative effort with a friend of mine, once was something that I was talking with a coworker about, and once just on my own in my head. This is a show I've thought about a lot, and I enjoy thinking about it, and that's one of the reasons I leapt on it. Now, in case anyone wondered, I've already decided the next show I will be doing. It is the second most requested show. That would be Babylon 5. Babylon 5's format will be very different from the format I'm doing for Voyager. I won't be doing a changes section. I won't be doing a then and now section. Well, I might. I don't know. That's a small enough section to put in. But one of the main differences is in Voyager, I talk about the episode and specific scenes and nuances and the problems and benefits thereof. In Babylon 5, I am more likely, and I can tell you this already, to talk about the overarching themes, the character developments, and the larger questions that are brought up, because there are a great many philosophical, political, economical, military, personal, religious, fundamental questions that are brought up by that show, and virtually all of them are never actually answered, and that's the point. They're put out there, you see different viewpoints, and then you're left to make up your own mind, which is one of the reasons I enjoy that show so much, because it is so, frankly, human. It is such a diverse, complicated mess, and I love it. So I'll be talking in broader strokes when we get to Babylon 5, just to give you an idea. Now, actually, I do believe that was it, wasn't it? So that was everything. Okay, so let's talk about the episode, alright? Today we're talking about... Oh, goodness. Oh, no, I'm sorry, right. Well, no, I don't need to mention that, I'm sorry. God, where are we? Here we go. Today we're going to be talking about the episode Eye of the Needle. Or is it Thread the Needle? I actually don't have the episode name written down here. I'm sorry, give me just one moment, let me check my monitor here. I could just start over, re-record this. You know what, I think I'm going to re-record this. Or I could just look at it right there. It is Eye of the Needle. I see it right there. See, one of the things I do is I just kind of curl up and watch, and I have these tiny little barely visible chicken scratches here as I'm like, okay. One of the things I don't like in television is something I also don't like in real life, and that is awkwardness. Now, I feel I needed to talk about this for just a minute, because awkwardness is basically just social interaction that is not acceptable for whatever reason, usually to the person defining it as awkward, right? What I mean by that is, of course, of course, we all have nervousness, right? We all have, a degree of, I worry, for lack of a better term. How am I going to do this? How am I going to say this? How do I look? Am I going to look like a buffoon? Am I going to portray, all sorts of problems like that? That's very normal. What I'm talking about is like a step past that, okay? I'm not talking about your basic social interaction that is awkward. What I define as awkwardness is when someone else is forcing it to such an extreme. Everyone does masks. I've talked about this before. Every human being I've ever encountered, which is many, does the masks thing. We portray ourselves differently when we are around other people. It's just how we are. That being said, when someone is doing it so forced, so artificially, so... hey, I actually stood in a mirror earlier during one of my bathroom trips to try and practice for this, because I was going to actually portray this to you. I failed because it is so hard to be that fake for me, because it's me, and it's so natural to just be like, hey guys, what's up, I wasn't able to do it, but I hope you guys know what I'm talking about, because this awkwardness is a problem that... This isn't just confined to Voyager. Star Trek in general has had this problem, even going back to the original series. It usually happens with the, this is a happy scene kind of thing, and I can just picture the director saying, okay, I want you to picture that this is the best thing to ever happen to you in your life. God himself just came down and pointed you and said, you are awesome for the next 20 seconds. Go. And that's just kind of the direction I picture, because that's artificial and fake and pointless and stupid, because we don't know what that feels like. Yes, I know acting is about portraying something that you're not actually personally feeling. But there's a limit of severity, you know? When you go to such an extreme, only a really talented actor can kind of pull that thing off, and usually those kind of talented actors have problems. I'm not saying anything against actors. This is statistically true. No offense to the crew of Voyager, because there are actually some very good actors on this show, but they are not incredibly psychotically good actors who can portray orgasmic levels of joy properly. And because I really do. I can just picture the director being like, "All right, yeah, just go, man, yeah." And so the very first scene of this episode is all that. I could barely stomach it. I found myself fast forwarding through it when I was watching it because it was actually unpleasant to watch. This is something else that will crop up in Voyager more than once. This is the first instance, but it will come up again. But again, this is not new to Star Trek in general. All of the shows had this. Yes, even Deep Space Nine had this. Even TNG had this. For God's sakes, season one TNG had this over and over again. I've got. I even have a good episode that had a scene like this. Wolf in the Fold, back in the original series. Right at the end of the episode, when they finally beam Jack the Ripper out into space dust, basically, they're like, yeah, and there's the forced laughter thing, and no, you get my point. My reason for bringing this up and discussing this is twofold. One, this is going back to that Trek comedy problem, because 90% of these are an instance of trying to portray comedy and failing at it. I really wish Trek would either give up on comedy or do what it is actually good at with comedy, which it does do certain things comedically properly, let's be honest with ourselves. But two, and more importantly, the whole point is that it feels forced. That's like one of the. I mean, it is forced, obviously, but it even comes across as feeling forced while it is actually forced. What's the point of that? And the problem is we once again get back to that problem that Voyager has so often, and Star Trek has had in general: filler. This is an episode where I would have cut several scenes in my changes, simply because I didn't think they added anything. I had nothing necessarily against them except for this first scene, which I wanted to. But other than that, I didn't really have anything against them, but they existed purely as filler. Now, obviously, this scene is a bit of an exception, but you would have cut this first scene down to a minute and a half, no, probably even less than that. You didn't even have to do the captain's log. You could have done a brief. You could have. Okay, I'm sorry to skip ahead here into the changes section because there's actually very few changes for this episode, believe it or not. Especially since I'm talking so negatively about the very first scene. But bear with me, okay? Set the tone for the whole episode. Have the first scene be Janeway being woken up from her bed, because, Captain, we found something. It might be a wormhole. And that's literally all you have to say. And Janeway's like, oh my god, I'll be right up. Cut to the bridge, okay? The bridge is a hive of activity. Harry is going all crazy all over the thing looking for this thing. Tom is also assisting with the thing. Tuvok, of course, is much more logical, but you can tell by and Tim Russ can pull this off. He's a good actor. He could pull off the thing of genuine interest in this thing because I mean Vulcan's emotionless blah blah blah. Vulcans can portray interest. They've done this before. You get my point. This whole scene could have been a barrage of activity until they get to this. And there is one thing I actually would have left in it. I would have portrayed it differently. But I would have left the line in. Harry says, could I argue, I forget how he phrased it, but I would like to name this the Harry Kim wormhole. That was actually kind of a nice little touch that I liked. One of the common things is that stellar phenomena tend to be named after the person who is credited with discovering them. And the fact that Harry caught this one, and that Harry is the one who would be named for this, is really awesome for two reasons. One, we know Harry Kim's a science nut, or at least he's supposed to be. And we do see on several occasions, and especially in my version of Harry, Harry is supposed to be a very intelligent, practically a prodigy, extremely intelligent child. Or obviously he's not a kid, he's 22, but God, I feel old. Anyways, the point is, having someone who is obviously that much into science, having a stellar phenomenon, having a wormhole named after them, that's the kind of thing that makes your day. I'm sorry, but I know too many people like that to think otherwise. That would be awesome. But the second and more important point is that Tom is saying in a somewhat almost passive aggressive way, if I could say that Harry did a good job. Tom is still portraying that role that I've talked about through several episodes now, of being Harry's mentor figure, of being his older brother figure, being the guy who is there to help him, being his best friend, and looking out for him, even in an official capacity like this, trying to give him those little morale boosts to remind him that, hey, you found a wormhole, that's awesome, congrats, That's why I liked that line. I think the delivery was a little stilted, but again, I blame that on the director, Mr. Joy. So, nevertheless, I did like that line. Now, I'm not going to talk about the probe being stuck. I actually made a little bit of a scribble here, probe stuck, blah, blah, blah. That's literally what I wrote. Probe stuck, blah, blah, blah. The thought that the probe could have get caught in gravitational eddies in a wormhole is at least feasible, even with what we know about wormholes now. It is also worth noting that the way wormholes work in Star Trek has always been different, uh, both from itself, but also from real life in many cases. So that didn't really bother me, but I just felt like mentioning it because I know a lot of people who pick apart the science of Star Trek uh, point out this point. I've heard this point discussed often. The wormhole isn't physical. Getting caught in a wormhole isn't really all that feasible. At the same time, I mean, it is plausible, but it is not that feasible. You get where I'm going with this. I just thought I'd mention it in passing. I do want to add one other point really quick. This actually deserves its own video. I'm not going to talk about it here. I'm going to talk about it when we get to Threshold. But in brief, one of the things Star Trek has done always, and most especially Voyager and the first couple of seasons of Enterprise, did very much so, is they would have magic in the disguise of science. Or that is to say, not literal magic, not like D&D or whatever, but I mean fantasy. Just making up the rules as they go and not trying to be self-consistent at all, and disguising that as scientific. And it is worth noting that Star Trek fans tend to come from scientific backgrounds. A lot of us, myself included, do know a fair amount about stellar phenomenon, about physics, about math, about calculus, blah, 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 blah. We tend to enjoy that sort of thing. That's not a stereotype. I'm not trying to call anybody out. I'm calling myself out here if I'm doing that as well. This isn't a negative. It's just simply a fact. There is a significant portion of the audience that does like the science thing, that likes science. It's an interesting category as far as I'm concerned, and I know several other people agree with me. This is why so many people had so much of an issue with Voyager in the first few seasons of Enterprise, because it wasn't science. And we know that. Even made-up science has to adhere to itself. Like I said, I'm not getting off on that one too much. I just wanted to mention it in a brief, because I just had this conversation with a friend of mine. I really, really like the Doctor scenes in this episode. I want to discuss them in one giant chunk, but there's several as they go through. So I'm going to skip this note and go to the next note, but I really do like that scene. Now, I am going to talk about Kes in this scene, though. This probably wasn't done intentionally, but nevertheless, it was a brilliant and indeed somewhat subtle move. And I need to lean back again. They have been portraying Kes as having some degree of mental powers ever since the first episode. That's something that the Okampa could do, right? And that was something that they were leaning in direction for very obviously already, right? But every indication thereof to date has been, the Professor X thing, for lack of a better way to put it. I very much like the fact that in this episode we see her as someone who is extremely sharply intelligent, has an eidetic memory, perfect memory basically, and who has a massive amount of intellectual curiosity, who has a thirst for knowledge. I mention that because it's actually kind of rare to find a human being, a person who has a genuine thirst for knowledge. This is true in real life as well as in fiction. And that kind of character development is actually really cool, I think, because it emphasizes those mental powers without having the voom voom part. You understand where I'm going with this? It's a much more mundane and much more subtle way to emphasize that Kess's mental powers are growing and becoming stronger, that her natural curiosity has now expanded itself to intellectual curiosity. Now she wants to know. And she wants to burn through those things. There's a later scene in the thing where she comes back with all the manuals and all the books that the doctor gave her, technical manuals as far as anatomy and stuff like that. And he quizzes her on like 3 or 4 things, and she's just like, bam, got it right there. Also, this is like a day later. She burned through all those manuals and books in a day. Yeah, enough said, right? That's the kind of thing that you kind of go with at first and don't really think about it, but the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. It's a fridge brilliance is the name for the trope for that, and I think this is an excellent example of that. Kess's natural curiosity and mental faculties developing as she goes. I thought that was really awesome. There was one other really nice scene that I actually rather like this episode. By the way, that's probably pretty obvious by the way I'm smiling and the fact that I'm on meds. But anyways, Taurus was calling Harry Starfleet. This is actually the first time she's done so since all the way back in Caretaker. I thought that was a nice nod, especially since part of the point of that was she originally called him Starfleet as an insult. And it's obvious that it was an insult. But by the end of Caretaker, I mentioned this, Taurus's and Harry's interactions back in Caretaker were actually really good. One of the highlights of that episode, in my opinion. And I really liked the fact that by the end of the episode, her calling him Starfleet was more of a honorific, right? So her mentioning it here in support of him and his plan to get these messages back to his family and to tell everyone was just a really nice human touch and helped flesh out Taurus and Harry again in those tiny little ways, subtle movements that really helped flesh out the characters. I also have to point out that Harry, this is the first episode I've seen Harry really be Harry as I envision him in. This is the first episode he's been allowed to act, basically. There's a lot of talk going around about what happened, or I should say there was a lot of talk going on about Harry Wong. Not Harry Wong. I suddenly can't think of the actor's name. The guy who played Harry Kim. Uh, I can't. Garrett Wong, I think. I'm sorry. I actually do have a degree of respect for the man, so I apologize for not getting it wrong. But basically, he kind of got the short end of the stick. Very similar to how I can't think of the actress's name. Tasha Yar did back in TNG, and there's a reason why she left in season one. And I tend to believe him because it's very obvious that they were basically treating his character as a footstool. Basically, it's there, it's comfortable, and I can rest my feet on it. But I did like the fact that he was allowed to actually act this episode. It really helped flesh him out. I also liked the fact that, where is it? Here it is. I know I was trying with my changes thing. I wanted to do it episode by episode, but I have to mention everything I talked about back in the cloud in my changes section about how I would have the whole arc be about the family getting together, about the way that friendships are made because one person takes a risk and invites someone else into the circle, so to speak. And speaking personally, that is kind of how it works, isn't it? Friendships just kind of happen sometimes. Most of the time, friendships happen when you say, hey, you reach out to them. So many of us are so afraid of interacting with other people now in this modern day and age to any random extent. Obviously, true fear, but I'm talking about even just on a standard nervousness level or just a hi. I don't want to get too off topic. But I really liked the fact that this episode and the whole talk about Taurus and Harry and what's waiting for them back home actually continues that theme that wasn't actually in the cloud, but in my version would be in the cloud, and I would definitely keep those scenes in this episode. Taurus talking about her past, not as a way of, not in place of character history or character development, but as a way to flesh her out, as a way to emphasize why it is that she is so close to the people that she is so close to, why it is that she's so emotionally unbalanced. you know, so much is revealed there within this short scene as she reveals there's nobody who cares one way or another about where I get home. And I bet in my changes, again, I'm going to do changes as I go because there's so few of them, I would have had Harry reach out another hand to Taurus here. Obviously, Harry and Taurus have some kind of working relationship going on here, but I would have had Harry have some kind of offer, some kind of olive branch to Taurus here, to try and keep that theme of friendship and the growing family going, because it's true, isn't it? Taurus has no one back home, and ironically, if you think about it, Harry basically has no one here. Obviously, he does now. He has Tom at the bare minimum. But that's actually really it at this point in time. All he has is Tom Paris, his best friend. Everything Harry Kim has is back home. And everything Taurus has is here on this ship. And I would love the idea of Harry being the one to reach out to Taurus in that circumstance. That makes so much sense to me, and would match the characters so well, in my opinion. I'm actually getting emotional. I am sorry. I am on some actual narcotics right now for the pain, so I apologize if I get emotional during this. But I thought that would I really would have liked that. Let's go ahead and move on here. I've been mostly positive, so let's talk about a negative, shall we? I think that's a good idea. One of the stupid things they did, especially in the early seasons of Voyager, was the will they get home plot. Now, I admit, I have tossed around ideas with friends about, throwing things into the mix, basically. Having a will they get home plot and actually having it succeed, either temporarily or permanently, and having the nature of the show change. But it's pretty obvious, based on the way the show has been done and the premise of the entire series of getting home, the Battlestar Galactica thing, that no, they aren't getting home this episode. In fact, forgive me, Voyager never gets home. Yes, I know in overall canon it does, but in the scope of the show, they never actually reach Earth. They never actually get there. So, no, of course not. And every time they do an episode whose plot is, will they get home yet? I feel like it's just an irritant. Now, I've said before I wouldn't do that many changes here. One of the main reasons I wouldn't do any changes here is because the structure of the story is actually well done enough that the will they get home plot is basically inconsequential to the actual story of the episode, if you follow what I mean. Certain elements of it wouldn't have evolved the way they did if the ability to beam through the relay of the wormhole wasn't possible. And I'm with that. What I am not with is the fact that they kept doing it over and over again. I'm not going to talk any more about it, but suffice it to say that it's just kind of hackney writing, really. In fact, I'm going to be even worse than that. I'm going to be more insulting. It is lazy writing. It's like having a story where the premise is the fact that you're stranded on an island, and one of the plots you keep doing is, will they get rescued this week? Because the answer's gotta be no. I'm looking at you, Gilligan. Again, a negative here, but I don't want to make a big deal about this. This is going back to that Trekker fan and the whole science geek thing. Obviously, there's. I'm gonna eject the speech out the window. Okay, speech just went out the window. Let's just focus on the matter at hand. A lot of Trekkers tend to, and Trekkies and Trek fans and people who watch Star Trek tend to pick up on the continuity details, right, and the flaws thereof. Nitpicking, if you prefer the term. I tend to nitpick things that either actively bother me personally, which is usually a large thing, or something that should be continuity. We'll get to that when we get to real life. But this is something that did actually bother me. I mentioned in the last episode, The Cloud, that one of the driving force of the episode, and indeed several of the previous episodes, has been energy reserves. Why did they go to that dilithium mine in the asteroid? They needed just an alternative source of energy. Why were they searching for alternate methods of stretching out their rations back in Parallax? Energy. Why were they going after the Cloud? Energy. This has been a driving force for more than one episode, and all of a sudden, all of that is thrown out the window as though it never happened. Janeway couldn't even get a cup of coffee that episode. And then we have a scene with Cass and Janeway where Janeway just walks over to the replicator and says, 2 big old bowls of stuff, let's go. I'm sorry, but in my professional opinion, that is not nitpicking at that point. You are taking something that has been a major plot point, a major story arc, and destroying it without even giving it a casual glance as an aside. And they do many things in this episode which are rather energy intensive without even having a mention of the fact that, in my changes, I would have kept most of these things except the replicator thing. But I would have done so in a manner that made it a point of the plot. I would have done so to emphasize, and this is why this boggles me, because this could have been done to enhance the episode. Have the energy reserves still be a problem. Have the source of power still be a problem. Have the crew so enthusiastic about this, and Janeway so on board with the idea to get home. We see several times in the episode she looks at a picture, or she thinks about Mark, I believe was his name, and she's got all these things going on in her head. She clearly has a decisive desire to make this work. Why not have them discuss the issues with power and whether or not we should waste power on getting these messages home, and then the ultimate decision be yes, because it's worth it. Because it is worth it to the captain, because it is worth it to the crew. You could even put it to a vote if you wanted to, and I bet you at least 90% of the crew would say yes, that they had someone at home that they felt it was worth wasting the power on to let them know they were still there. In my opinion, that would have enhanced the episode, added to it. And I cannot believe they missed on that. That's why I wanted to comment on that. This whole page is the doctor topic I want to talk about, including half of this page, too. This is going to take up most of my actual discussion about the episode. But I want to talk about Vaughn Armstrong first. Vaughn Armstrong is an awesome actor, in my opinion. He is a long-term Star Trek actor, and he has a competence about him that he tends to portray his any given role with a degree of subtlety that most other people can't. Most people, when they're told to portray a Romulan, for example, he plays the Romulan in this episode. For anyone who doesn't know, someone who is told to portray a Romulan will go to the extreme, or to, at the very least, the stereotype. Okay. Most people told to portray a Klingon. Same thing. This gentleman, and he's played several other roles throughout the series. Series I should say. This guy's been around since TNG, since season one TNG, I believe, or season one or season two, very early, with the Klingon. That was his first role. But either way, this guy's been around for forever, and he does excellent work adding nuances to his role, and I love that. I had a couple little tiny notes here. I'm going to try and read here. Well, there's the nuance thing. He I love the fact that, for example, on several occasions, he actually acts as someone who is trying to keep on who he is acting as someone who's trying to act. You follow me? He's acting as someone who's trying to keep the mask of the Romulan on, but every now and again he'll let it slip. He'll let the scientist and he'll let the family man in and through. He'll let the person underneath that see through. It added a wonderful layer of depth to his character of having, for example, every now and again, he gets beamed over there and he's like, Romulan Star Empire. But then he looks around with such genuine enthusiasm and congratulates them on their scientific achievement because it's a marvel to him, a scientist. You follow me? And for example, I cannot allow. I am just a man. I will not tell the Romulan Empire to speed up its process. And then Janeway starts talking to him about his family. And again, that mask slips, and you see him talk about his daughter he's never seen. And you see something. I hate to keep using this word, but I use this because that is what we are. You see the humanity there. It is so simple and so wonderfully done. So much of what I enjoy in this episode comes from Mulgrew and Armstrong's performances. The two act off of each other very well, even when they're only doing so in voice, and from the Doctor, which I'll get to later, because that's a big discussion. But it is so powerfully done. Wonderful, wonderful performance. Let's see here. Where's my next? One of the things I also like about this guy is this gentleman. What's the character name? I actually wrote it down so I remember. Telekramar. Or is that an R? An N? I can't even read my own handwriting. I was just kind of doing this. Telek, okay. Most people, when they picture a Romulan, tend to picture a Romulan called Tomalak. If you have any familiarity at all with Romulans in Star Trek, you probably know the name Tomalak. He has been in quite a few things. He is portrayed by oh my god, I don't know how to pronounce his name. I wrote it down too. Katsulas? Is that right? He's the gentleman who played Jakar over on Babylon 5. And I want to stress, I don't want to mispronounce his name, so I'm not going to try again, but I have nothing but respect for the man. He is a magnificent actor. He is an amazing actor. And he did put a degree of awesomeness into his role as Tomalak. But most people picture Tomalak as a Romulan not only because he was the voice and face of the Romulans for quite a while in TNG when the Romulans came back as an actual power in the Star Trek universe, but B, because he was wonderfully enjoyable in his role of the cantankerous, and kind of being a jerk, if you know what I mean. I don't want to use actual words that I want to use here for obvious reasons. I tend to picture this guy because this guy is someone who clearly has. This guy speaking is Telek, the guy played by Vaughn Armstrong. He has an obvious pride in his people, in his nation, in his government, whatever you want to call it, the Romulan Star Empire. He has an obvious, I am a Romulan sort of mentality, which you do expect from Romulans, especially given their source of government, and the fact that they have a great deal of societal pride about that fact. But he also has other nuances to him that I also tend to see in Romulans, such as a great emphasis on family and a great deal of interest in achievement. In his case, it is scientific achievement, but the idea of achieving, of accomplishing, of stretching out is something that Romulans in general do tend to engender. And so this is I tend to think of this character in this episode, Star Trek Voyager of all things. When I think of the Romulan, the guy that portrays Romulans best, this is or girl, obviously. I don't want to be male or female here, doesn't matter. When I think of a Romulan, this is the individual I tend to think of most because he did such a wonderful job of it. Excuse me. I have heard of complaints about the, hmm. I've heard complaints before about the beaming twist to the plot. I mentioned this briefly before, and this is the one of the few other areas where my changes are going to come into this. Um, and actually, I guess I should wait until I start talking about the Doctor more because that has everything to do with the Doctor. I'm sorry, I keep putting it off. Not to keep banging on about this. I just wrote all I wrote here was Chakotay. But there are so many scenes in this episode, and this is, again, not just in this episode, this will continue to be a trend for a while, where Chakotay is basically just kind of standing there posing. I can't do it right now because my back hurts too much, but no. Just doing the pose thing and just kind of being there. Or occasionally, he's trying to do a really awkward smile when you can tell it's really not in him. And again, no offense to Robert Beltran whatsoever. I do have a respect for the man. But I felt so bad for him, and you know it's really obvious when it's something that I feel like I have to comment on. This is not me. This is not me, going over frame by frame throughout the episode. And Chakotay does have a couple of lines in this episode, in like the first scene and in like the beaming scene, and I believe that's it actually. Um, but the rest of the time he's just kind of there posing, and it is so obviously awkward that I just felt like they could have either done something with it or ejected it or something. One other point I want to add here is the Romulan's fate. I've actually debated this off and on, more than not, whether or not I felt the Romulans should have died. Obviously, from a writer's perspective, it doesn't actually matter. This is important, okay? For any of you who don't know, out there who don't who are not writers, let me just give you a little bit of a peek here, right here. From the writer's perspective, having the Romulan live or die is completely inconsequential because either way can lead to both possible general outcomes, or indeed, any possible general outcome. Having him be alive does not mean a guarantee that the messages are getting out. Having him dead does not mean a guarantee that they won't. So from a writing perspective, the only reason to have him live or die is because of the different kind of impact you want the news to have on the crew. And indeed, the viewer. You with me? I actually meant the viewer in general. I'm not sure why I said the crew, because this is about writing, not about the setting. That's different. That's story. That's world building. That's different than writing. So again, from a writing perspective, what do you want your viewer to feel at the end of this episode? Now, this is purely opinion, but I personally would not have had there be any news about his life or death. In fact, one of the things I would do is have Janeway or somebody, possibly Harry, possibly Torres, somebody would have asked Tuvok, do we have a Telek Ramor, or whatever the heck his name was, on our records? And Tuvok would have said, no. With that little bit of information out there, they have no idea what has happened, or if they altered the timelines at all, or if the messages got through. The air is literally completely open the air, and I personally prefer that out. Oh, God, words. I prefer that mindset, because what that does is then put it on the viewer to do this thing I've been talking about with regards to the Half-Life series in general recently about first-person storytelling. When you present about just enough information in a certain manner, it is the human brain's natural tendency to think about it. That's what the human brain does. Most people do this subconsciously, so there are people out there who would automatically assume that he's dead, that he is not on record because he was found out to be a traitor by the Romulan Empire or whatever and was killed, and obviously Starfleet doesn't know. And there are some people out there who would automatically assume that he got the message out. And then there are some people out there who would think about it and debate between the two. But that's exactly my point. In my opinion, leaving it that open-ended on this manner is not a cop-out from a writing perspective, but rather designed is something I would do in order to leave it more open-ended for the viewer to interpret as they see fit. I would probably also have this come back in at some point in the future. In fact, I would definitely have it come back in the future. But again, I don't want to rewrite the whole series a fourth time. But one of the reasons this is important too, and I just feel like stressing this, in my opinion, writing should make sense in universe and out of universe. Okay, it should make sense from a meta perspective, from the perspective of the viewer and the audience and whatever your target audience is, and it should make sense in universe so that you don't see Janeway acting crazy every other episode. This this makes sense in both manners. It is completely possible and completely probable, actually, that they would have no idea who this gentleman is. Let us keep in mind that at the time at which Voyager left, the Romulan Empire and the Federation, while on decent terms, were not exactly well off, especially given the tensions of the Dominion, which at this point were already getting pretty bad. It is incredibly likely that oh, I'm sorry. Let's also not forget the fact that the Romulan Empire was very close to going to war with the Federation, or at the very least, taking aggressive actions against the Federation more than once without TNG. So it is entirely feasible that they simply would not have information on this guy. It is also entirely feasible that they would have killed him and removed him from the records because this is the Romulans and that's the kind of thing that would do. It is also entirely feasible that he changed his name and something happened, but whatever. There are so many possibilities here and all of them make sense. You don't have to twist in order to make this happen. In my opinion, saying flat out that he died was a mistake because the only point of that was to cut off the door, was to close the door, if you understand what I mean. And that is lazy writing. This is actually worse than the torpedoes thing, than the power crisis thing. This is the worst kind of anti-continuity. Actively going out of your way to ensure that continuity doesn't have to be bothered with here. Case closed. The end of the episode. Reset button. Boom. Now, let's talk about the Doctor. Throughout the episodes we've covered so far, we have seen the Doctor slowly be humanized by his actions and his interactions with other people. We have seen him be portrayed. Only in the first episode was he really treated as a tricorder. Every other episode he's been treated as a person, relatively speaking, especially by Kes, who is most often the individual interacting with him. I mention this because obviously in an in-universe perspective, dozens of other people are talking to the Doctor every day. But we, the viewers, keep seeing Kes interact with him, and so we keep seeing someone who treats him like a person with respect and dignity and at a degree of honor, right? That's important because this scene right at the beginning, in my opinion, was brilliant. I doubt it was done on purpose, but I believe it was made into this deliberately by the actor who played the Doctor. God, I'm sorry, I can't think of his name right now. Ricardo or Picardo, whatever his name is. Um, Robert Picardo, so it is a P. He's talking to a crewman who is literally not even looking at him, who is responding to his questions by dealing them, by responding to them to Kes, who is, in his opinion, from his viewpoint, the actual person he's dealing with, while as the Doctor is the tool she is using. That is his perspective. Now, this is a somewhat extreme perspective, but I think this was a good start for this episode. I actually agree with this rather strongly. Having him treat the Doctor as though he's basically not even there, like I'm treating my webcam right now. I'm not treating it like a person because it's a webcam, right? That sort of automatic assumption, I think, was absolutely brilliant, or at least could have been brilliant, especially in my envisioning of this, because we are seeing the total opposite perspective and how immensely stupid this kind of prejudice can actually be. One of the lines the guy says is, if I had to be operated on, would he be the one to do it? Or would, I forget how he phrases it. I don't think he actually honorifically calls him he. It's just, would this thing do it? And the Doctor says yes. And the guy says, oh, I don't know. I'd have to think about that a second. Then Picardo says the obvious thing. In fact, I wrote it down. Hang on. Well, if you were lucky, then you wouldn't die on the operating table while you made up your mind. I loved this because, in my mind, well, this is in a large way the way my mind works. The idea of prejudice in this manner doesn't actually make sense to me. Now, let's be fair. We don't actually. It is very debatable as to whether or not the Doctor is actually sentient. I've actually heard people, fans of the show, who argue strongly that he isn't. I would argue strongly that he is. I shouldn't say argue, because obviously I would debate, I would discuss that he is sentient. That is my viewpoint on this matter. And from my viewpoint, feeling uneasy that the individual who is operating on me is slightly different than everyone else who happens to be around me, and having that be the thing that bothers me, is completely ludicrous to me, and I love the way that Picardo just completely slams him down so calmly, does so with just a tiny bit of bitterness and resignation in his tone, but does not do so with genuine ire. He is not, he one of the things we see here in the modern age especially, but in the last 20 years this has been a very big problem in real life, is we will see people who are on one side of an issue who are, let's use homosexuality, okay? I hate to pull that one out, but it's a good example because I've been through this one myself. Um, or rather, I've been in the middle. You get the point. On one side, we have people who are like, "Oh, gays suck, and they should all be burned," and blah blah blah, right? And then on the total opposite extreme, we have people who tend to go to the total opposite of that, who get so fired up. I'm not going to voice anything, but who get so fired up against these people and are so, we should have gay everything and gay tolerance, and the fact that you don't want pink on your shirt means you're totally anti-gay. These two extremes are both ridiculous, in my opinion. I'm just saying that flat out right now. Normally, I don't even like voicing that opinion because that is such an unpopular one. But I don't like either of these extremes. I never have, not for years. I was in California. I lived there when this was going on with the homosexuality thing, the total extreme anti-gay and the total extreme anti-anti-gay thing, and it was ludicrous and stupid. And by the way, I have several homosexual friends, had then too, and most of them I knew thought the whole thing was frickin' stupid because it is. Just saying. Why am I bringing this up? Because Ricardo was right in the middle, and I loved it. He could have gone off. He could have yelled at the guy. He could have blasted him. Even when he finally does reprimand him later in the episode, stands up for himself. He does so in moderation. He does so with a he pulls himself back. He doesn't go off in a tirade. He just says, "You're an idiot," basically. And he does this here in this scene as well. And I liked that because, in my opinion, that is a more proper response. You don't make an argument any better. You don't pose the opposing side of an argument that you agree with any better by yelling and screaming it, in my opinion. And I really liked the subtlety of that. Now, skip ahead. What was the next thing about the Doctor I wanted to talk about? Ah, yes, the arc and the Janeway scene, and then... Oh, wow, I actually skipped a scene. Oh, well, I'll get to that in a second. Any of you who have seen the episode Measure of a Man in TNG probably know everything I'm about to say. Apologies for the repetition. Measure of a Man is one of my favorite TNG episodes ever. I mean that sincerely. This is also speaking as someone who was alive at the tail end of that whole deal. And again, if you know what I'm talking about, you know exactly what I mean. It's funny how the things that we have personally experienced in life, when they are allegorically, when they're put in allegory within fiction, we tend to resonate with them. For example, Star Trek 6 is my favorite movie. Do you know I actually was watching TV when the Berlin Wall was coming down? So, The Measure of a Man was all about, does Data have sentient rights, as all other sentient beings do within the Federation? That was the whole point of that episode. Now, that's funny to put it in those terms, because looking back, the answer would be, well, duh. But at the time that TNG came out, that was still something that people were getting a hold of, that people were still wrapping their minds around, because we had gone through so many decades of people not having proper rights. Let's be frank, we still don't have actual true civil rights for whoever, for everyone, here in the modern age. And I'm not just talking about within the States. I mean, for God's sakes, I don't want to get too much into this topic in real life terms, but one of the reasons it was so powerful in the episode was because it was so copy-paste in the proper way from real life. So many people, even Picard himself, tried to convince Data to go along with it. And Data responded with a perfectly logical reasoning about how the whole reason that Picard was in favor of this was because Data wasn't human. And in that moment, Picard realized he himself had prejudices about Data that he probably didn't even realize he had. And Patrick Stewart did a wonderful job with the role, because he looked just floored, and he did it in such a quiet, dreadful way. And then he actually dismisses Data because it's just wow, I bring that episode up because the plot arc of the Doctor was one of the very few arcs that was designed in advance, and it shows. The Doctor's arc throughout the whole series so far has been developing in every episode and will continue to do so for some time, for actually a great deal of time. And this is the advantage of having a plot arc planned out in advance. Babylon 5 is basically the example I like to use as here's a show that has been planned in advance, but Voyager did get one thing very right. The Doctor's arc has always been about the measure of a man. What is it that we define as sentient? Some people have had discussions with me about whether or not the Doctor is sentient. I just mentioned this. And as I said, I agree that I think that he is. If absolutely nothing else, I believe that this is the episode where it was the turning point. I'll get to that in a moment. But it is very clear that we are trying to empathize with this character. He has been portrayed as sympathetic constantly throughout the whole thing, even despite his acerbic attitude. Nevertheless, it is an attitude of someone who feels, and I hate to use that word feels in this case for a hologram, but the fact remains, unappreciated, or underappreciated if you prefer. Someone who feels that this is so beyond anything he was supposed to deal with, and the frustration he's feeling is a literal manifestation of the programs that actually define him clashing one with another and not being certain how to proceed forward. In other words, the same exact thing we humans feel when we get frustrated, just projected in a different manner. One of the biggest points I bring up as to whether or not the Doctor is sentient is my argument that the holodeck technology itself is, to a degree, sentient. I have made this case many times. I think I've made this case in my videos as well. To summarize, a computer that has the ability to perfectly adapt to anything you do, by definition, has to be sentient to some extent or another. Has to have some degree of sentience. It has to have the ability to adapt near perfectly to any type of input. And this is what we see on the holodecks. Now, whether or not those individual holograms are sentient, no, I would not argue that they are. I would argue that those are no more sentient than the characters I write in my stories are up here. While I, the sentient being, may be able to have them react to anything in any way, that is coming from me and not from them, okay? The difference with the Doctor is the holodeck, in his case, is the Doctor. There is no segregation. The program and the programs and the programs that all make him up and project him into that into that I suddenly can't think of the word. The sick bay. Oh my God, I couldn't think of the word. The sick bay. Everything that projects him into that sick bay is one cohesive unit. There is no degree of separation between the two, okay? And by design, he is designed in the same manner that the holodeck is, to be able to adapt to basically anything. Now, as we see throughout the series, he can't adapt to perfectly to anything. But the sheer level of control he shows over that, and especially the big point, which I'll get to basically at the end here, in my opinion, qualifies him as that. And that is definitely the opinion the show itself takes, because that is his plot arc. Not only his growth into an individual, to become an individual, but then his growth as an individual. This is one of the truest strengths of Voyager, in my opinion. I know I've said that before, but I feel it deserves emphasizing. Later on, the Janeway. Janeway comes by to talk with the Doctor, and that is an absolutely amazing scene. I also like that scene for one other reason. Again, this is a subtlety that I have to credit somebody in the episode, either the writer or the director or Picardo himself. He mentions that he looks really irritable. His performance is so subtle. If you've ever seen his IMDb page, that man is not exactly a bad actor. He knows what he's doing. He comes up to her with sheer irritation. What? You can basically see it in his face. But he is still trying to restrain it. I like that. I love the fact, yes, I'm peaceful. And as soon as she says there's no emergency, he visibly relaxes and says, "Oh, that's good." And that's interesting because someone who you would think a program which is designed to heal people would be irritated, would be frustrated when there is no emergency. An emergency holograph, not having emergency would be the kind of thing you would. This is more. This is. I'm just saying this because this is more fuel to the fire, in my opinion, of the fact that he is more than simply the EMH. If you follow where I'm going with this, so he goes off and he starts, Janeway's, like, what's going on? And the doctor reveals a fact, a very beautifully subtle fact, that he was preparing something for one ensign, I don't remember the names, and another ensign turned him off. That simple point shows us the third viewpoint in the prejudice against and for the doctor. We've seen Kess's viewpoint and what will become Janeway's viewpoint, even though it will slant a little over the series. Let's just move on. Kess's viewpoint is that he is a person. The idiot from the beginning's viewpoint is that he is a webcam, right? This third perspective is beautiful. The other person turned him off. Now, not a few minutes after this fact, he reveals that he gets really irritated when people forget to turn him off. He wishes people would stop leaving him on. This has been happening since the first episode. This is a demonstrable fact and something we see over and over again. I mention all of this because it is not unlikely that this ensign who turned him off was trying to be polite, was trying to be nice about it, and yet because she still didn't consider him a person, it never occurred to him to ask him if he wanted to be turned off at that moment. You see this? You see the subtlety here? You see the viewpoint, the third viewpoint here? I love it. I absolutely love it. It is such a minor, tiny little piece that changes everything because it really highlights the three perspectives of the crew and really gives us a fully three-dimensional picture, no pun intended, of the Doctor. I also really like the fact that the problem with that ensign who turned him off without thinking about it in order to be nice, when you really boil it down, has the same core problem with regarding to the Doctor and how they perceive him as the gentleman from the beginning. I also love the fact that when Janeway is starting to talk to him about him, he starts talking with a really quiet resignation and just a little bit of defensiveness. Are you gonna? I can't even do it. I can't do that level of subtlety. Not when I'm this out of it. Are you going to reprogram me? There is such resignation in his voice, and I love that because one of the next things he says again is how much time he has to do nothing. But one of the things he is capable of doing in that time is thinking. And would not one of those thoughts he has be, what do I do when they reprogram me? Are they going to reprogram me? And logically speaking, and let's be honest, he's right because they were going to reprogram him until Kessin involved herself. Yeah, they were going to reprogram him, and he was right. They were going to do that. But the best part of all is that he is showing through his actions and through his response to this thought that he doesn't want to be, that he wants to be himself. This is a plot point that will come up several times in the future. The strongest element, I think, will come up way further in the future when he goes and visits his creator, who tries to improve him. And he doesn't want to be improved. He wants to be himself. He actually likes who he is. You understand where I'm going with this? Such wonderful subtlety in this episode. I love it. Skip ahead. Now I'm going to break from the Doctor for just a second because there's a scene I skipped. I apologize. There's a scene where Mulgrew is basically talking at the air. If you've ever seen acting, you know that she is probably on that set, hearing some kind of audio cues as to when it is to say her next line, and then they added in the speech from the Romulan later. That's hard to do, acting-wise, just for reference. But I have to give her full props because she showed such simple, sheer humanity in her performance. Anybody who's been in a dire strait knows that combination of hope and sheer terror that being honest is, okay? Now, let me explain myself a little bit. If you are in a dire strait and you desperately need something to happen or want something to happen, and you realize that the other person involved, the individual who has the power to make this happen or not happen, who has the power to take advantage of you over this fact, in whatever manner, and you realize that you basically are at their mercy if you were to do so, if you were to put yourself at their mercy, There is a fear and a hope in being honest about it. And what I mean by that is by basically begging, by showing your desperation. We as human beings know that other human beings tend to take advantage of us. That's just life. It sucks, but it's life. If you show another human that you are desperate, and they know it, it's basically a toss of the coin as to whether or not they are going to actually help you or make things worse. Mulgrew portrays this that the horror of that feeling in that moment. I know several of you know what I'm talking about. That there's a specific feeling you feel when you do this, when you are so desperate and you let it show. And Mulgrew portrays that as she is begging this Romulan, begging him to think about this, to stay in contact, to consider sending our messages back. And he's been rebuffing her this whole time, and that's one of the reasons she has this fear, is because she realizes that A, he could use this to her advantage, and B, he could just fling her out the window. He is under no obligation. There is nothing she can do to convince him, or coerce him, or even repay him. She is at his mercy to get these messages back, and she knows it. I loved the simple humanity of that scene. Let's get to my final point. I've been building up to it this whole time. I've discussed, right, hang on. The whole holodeck sentience thing, right? I don't need my notes for this one. It is my opinion that this episode is when the Doctor became sentient. Truly sentient. Unarguably sentient. My reason for that is a beautiful irony, and I wish it was done on purpose. I know it wasn't. I know it wasn't. But looking at it from an in-story perspective, it makes perfect sense, and I personally would make this clear if I was changing this, either now or later. As I mentioned, the Doctor is, for all intents and purposes, a single, cohesive holodeck, capable of adapting. That's important. That is its entire purpose, to utilize the information it has, which is massive, by the way, and the extent thereof, and use it to adapt. In this episode, the captain, someone that the computer knows has the full authority and respect of everything and everyone, and therefore, I'm sorry, I'm making this point because Kes has been treating him as a human this whole time, as a person this whole time. But the captain then comes by, and the captain treats him as a person. The captain treats him as a member of her crew. And the computer knows what that means, because it is different. As much as it could be argued that it shouldn't matter, if the captain comes to you, especially on a Starfleet programmed computer program here, and says, what can I do for you? How can I make things work for you? Is there anything else we could do? Because you are a member of our crew. It is my opinion, my viewpoint, and my change that is the moment at which the program started to adapt again. Truly adapt. And started treating itself, rather than the EMH, because it has, if you look back, it has been basically treating itself as the EMH this whole time. After all, why was there not such genuine resignation in his voice? Because he's just the EMH. He doesn't deserve to have his rights defended. Later on, he would actually argue, and indeed fight, for his right to be an individual. But at this point in time, he just kind of gives up with a shrug, because he was still thinking of himself as an EMH. Now he starts thinking of himself as a member of the crew. And that change opened up the gateway, in my opinion. Just a few episodes from now, we'll be seeing an episode where the Doctor really has his first true The Doctor episode. And I love the fact that it happened after this one, because it is such a wonderful way to flesh out the character and let him expand. But there is something so impacting about that moment, because it is so beautifully ironic. And I don't think anybody did it on purpose. And I don't think anybody, from an in-story perspective, knew it was happening. I don't think the Doctor himself would even realize. In my version, for example, I don't think the Doctor himself would realize this is the moment at which he became a sentient, individual. And I would certainly not make Janeway aware of the fact that her treating him like one is what precipitated that change. Now, actually, there was one other thing I wanted to talk about. I actually just remembered as I was putting this away. But I really love that moment. I wish it was done on purpose. Measure a man. My dog. God, I can barely read my own handwriting here. Mulgrove, Alan Armstrong, who was awesome. The different perspectives about the Doctor. I swear there was something else I wanted to talk about. But apparently I am wrong. That's a map. I was doing a map of the continents earlier. In my game, in my D&D game. Um, but apparently I can't remember what the heck it was. Oh well, doesn't matter. Sorry for rambling on a little bit, but I really did enjoy this episode. Speaking of which, did I enjoy this episode then? Yeah, I did. I really did. I didn't have a good reasoning for it at the time. I mean, I was quite a bit younger when this episode came out, after all. Did I enjoy it on repeat viewings? God, yes. So far, every episode that we've gone through has been, at the very least, just kind of average, right? I have not actually despised any episode we've gotten to yet. That'll be the next one. Um, but this episode, Eye of the Needle, is the first episode I could say I truly sat down and enjoyed watching. And honestly really had just great performances, great concepts. Even the story, which started from a cliche but then took it into a new direction, explored it in a different manner. I was with it. I'm still with it. And I definitely enjoyed it. Definite kudos for actually getting a good episode of Voyager out. Now, I have talked for way too long, so I'm going to go rest my throat and then record the next video.